Ned, some people still know.
That's not how the spell works.
So MJ's gonna forget about everything we've ever been through?
Stop tampering with the spell.
Oh my god, Ned, he's my best friend. Oh, my Aunt May should really know.
Stop talking!
With the imminent release of Spider-Man No Way Home, I thought it would be worth looking into Spider-Man's cinematic journey and how we've gone from nothing all the way to the multiverse. In addition, I'm going to do a full review and rank each of the movies in order from worst to best. Since the first part of this video is a full recap, there naturally will be spoilers for those films, but not for the upcoming movie. Spider-Man was created in 1962 and has since gone on to feature in many comics, animated TV shows and movies. But to understand how we've moved from Aunt May's small house in the city of New York to dealing with multiple universes, we have to go back to the very beginning. Okay, maybe not the very beginning, but the beginning of the cinematic journey of Spider-Man. There were actually plans for a Spider-Man movie all the way back in the 70s, with many well-known directors being considered, most notably James Cameron. But essentially, it all started in 1999 when Sony Pictures added Spider-Man to their film empire. This meant that Sony now had the official rights to this franchise and related characters, something that has remained the case even today. They immediately put things in motion for a movie which led to Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man origin story. Starring Tobey Maguire, it shows Peter Parker, an intelligent but somewhat unpopular high school senior, building up to his life after school. It quickly introduces us to two very notable characters from the original material in Mary Jane Watson, his high school crush, and Harry Osborn, his best friend. Peter is portrayed as an enthusiastic academic and shows a real affinity for science. At the start of the film, the characters are all on a school trip to a university genetics laboratory. Unknown to them at the time, a genetically engineered super spider had escaped from its containment area and comes in contact with Peter and bites him. The movie follows very closely to the original comic at this stage. This leads him to feeling quite ill and goes home to recuperate. At the same time, Harry's father, Norman Osborn, who owns a multi-billion-dollar company called Oscorp, is put under pressure to secure a military contract. He needs a successful human trial. Out of desperation, he decides to experiment on himself with a performance-enhancing chemical compound. This, however, has psychological consequences and side effects, and in a fit of rage he kills his assistant. Norman is now in a duplicitous and possessed-like state, and even steals military equipment for personal use. The following morning, Peter wakes up with an unexpectedly muscular physique, the ability to shoot web out of his wrists, and a spider sense, which gives him almost instantaneous reaction time to potential threats. In addition, Peter discovers he has superhuman agility, strength, and speed. However, his first course of action is to use these newfound abilities for personal gain. Faced with a confrontation with high school bully Flash Thompson, Peter realizes he's no longer the weak and vulnerable he once was. This spurs him to sign up to an underground wrestling tournament as a means to earn some easy money on the side. Uncle Ben, however, senses there's a personality change in Peter, and preemptively warns him with the timeless and profound phrase,
"With great power comes great responsibility."
A line that resonates through the spine of the entire Spider-Man story. Peter eventually wins the tournament he signed up for, but his triumph is short-lived. He heads outside and finds Uncle Ben lying at the side of the road after being carjacked, and sadly dies shortly after. It was this moment that really initiated Peter's metamorphosis from ordinary Peter Parker to crime-fighting Spider-Man. The movie goes on to show the progression and growth of his character, which leads to the inevitable crossing of paths with Norman Osborn, now known as the Green Goblin. In the process, Spider-Man saves the life of Mary Jane, which leads her to becoming progressively infatuated with the mysterious masked hero. Of course, she doesn't realise that she actually knows the person beneath the mask. The film ends with a gritty and dark climactic confrontation between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. Eventually revealing the identity of the Green Goblin to Peter, Norman deceitfully pleads to Peter's humanity, but his deception is quickly realised when Peter's spider sense saves his life and ultimately ends Norman's. This leaves Peter conflicted and Harry Osborn filled with hate for Spider-Man, the one he deems his father's killer.
I swear on my father's grave, Spider-Man will pay.
It also results in Peter's relationship with Mary Jane being fragmented. At the film's conclusion, he makes the difficult decision to end romantic ties with MJ, as he feels his life as Spider-Man is too dangerous to have people close to him. This opening entry to the Spider-Man movie franchise was met with positive critical and commercial success, which led to Sony putting forth plans for a sequel. Spider-Man 2 came out 2 years later in 2004 and conveniently takes place 2 years after the events of the previous film. One of the prominent themes in this movie continues on from the last, which is balancing the lives of his two identities. This conflict of character results in the unwanted side effect of Peter intermittently and sporadically losing his abilities. Harry is now head of Oscorp's Genetic and Scientific Research Division, and Mary Jane is engaged to John Jameson, an astronaut and son of J. Jonah Jameson.
You're fired!
Chief, the planetarium party.
Oh, right, you're unfired. I need you. Come here.
The core of the story is Harry sponsoring a fusion-powered project led by nuclear scientist Otto Octavius. Due to the nature of working with dangerous materials and equipment, Octavius designed and wears a specific harness attached to several robotic arms and a built-in artificial intelligence. Octavius acts as a mentor and supervisor for Peter, and during a scientific demonstration, a power spike causes the fusion reactor to become unstable. Adamant that his work is on the verge of a breakthrough, he refuses to shut down the reactor, which has devastating repercussions. It kills his wife and fuses the robotic arms to his nervous system. The one and only inhibitor chip that acts as a safeguard between his arms and his brain also gets destroyed. Dr. Octavius is soon taken to a hospital where many surgeons and medical staff attempt to revive the scientist as well as remove his arms. This leads to one of the best scenes in the entire franchise and is reminiscent of a 1980s horror film. He has now become Dr. Octopus, and is partly corrupted by his own scientific ambitions but also the sentient AI. He becomes obsessed with finishing the experiment he started, and does whatever he feels necessary in order to get there. This includes robbing a bank, and visits Harry Osborn in order to obtain a rare isotope called tritium to fuel his new reactor.
Kill Spider-Man. We'll give you all the tritium you need. On second thought, bring him to me. Alive.
Peter Parker. And the girlfriend.
This leads to several epic showdowns and eventually results in Peter being captured and delivered back to Harry. He is absolutely stunned upon the revelation that Spider-Man, the killer of his father, is in fact his best friend. Peter tries profoundly to convince Harry that there are bigger issues at stake. Harry reluctantly lets him go and we arrive at the final confrontation. After some resistance, Peter manages to persuade Octavius that he needs to let his dreams go for the greater good. At this point, he commands his arms to sabotage the project and sacrifices himself as one final gesture of redemption. Overall, Spider-Man 2 was received very well, with many critics saying that it had more emotional depth and improved on the original. It also had decent success in terms of the box office. This naturally led to a third installment which picks up several months after the second film. We are introduced to a few new characters here, first of which is Flint Marko. He is an escaped convict who during his prison breakout falls into an experimental particle accelerator that fuses his body with the surrounding sand. This gives him the ability to harness the sand around him and moulds his body into all sorts of useful shapes. It is later revealed that Marco is actually Uncle Ben's original killer, and the person Peter believed to be the culprit was just his accomplice. This leads on to a brief encounter with Spider-Man, but Flint, also known as Sandman, proves to be too strong for him. Separately, Harry Osborn becomes increasingly resentful over the death of his father and decides to follow in his footsteps by using the performance-enhancing gas and Green Goblin technology. Meanwhile, a meteorite containing an alien symbiote lands in New York and follows Peter to his apartment. It combines with his Spider-Man suit, creating an enhanced version. However, over time this corrupts Peter, his conscience, and apparently also his dancing. His actions all but sever his relationship with Mary Jane, and even disfigure Harry's face. Before it fully destroys his life irreversibly, he manages to remove the suit through its one and only weakness, high-pitched sounds. However, this didn't fully solve the problem, as Peter was unaware that he was being followed by rival photographer Eddie Brock. The symbiote defaults to the next best candidate and combines with Brock to create Venom. The rest of the film builds to one final clash between Spider-Man and the two new villains, and later joined by Harry. Thankfully, he has since discovered that his father is far from blameless and Peter not truly guilty. He therefore helps Spider-Man deal with the two villains. At the end, it is revealed that Uncle Ben's death was actually an accident and has haunted Flint Marko ever since. Peter goes on to forgive Sandman and allows him to escape.
The only thing left to me now is my daughter.
He also deals with Venom using the same means as he did with himself, making use of high-pitched noises. Unfortunately, Harry was injured during the process, and sadly succumbs to these injuries. This concludes the original Spider-Man trilogy. There are actually provisional plans for a fourth film, but these were later cancelled. Sony instead opted for a complete reboot, which led to the Amazing Spider-Man film series. These now star Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker and were directed by Mark Webb. The first film, now rebranded as The Amazing Spider-Man, released in 2012. Due to the nature of a reboot, the film revisits much of the same territory as the original origin story, with the death of Uncle Ben and him being bitten by a genetically engineered spider as clear examples. It does add a bit of a conspiracy arc to the core of the story, with hidden backstories for Peter's parents. A new character is introduced in Dr. Kurt Connors, a scientist and researcher at Oscorp. His speciality is in the field of cross-species genetics, but is missing a core element to his latest project. Peter discovers his father has the answers that Connors was looking for, and provides it to him, allowing for the first stage of animal trials. Despite the swiftness of his success, he is pressured into human trials at the threat of his job. This leads him to trying it on himself. He passes out and soon awakens to find that his missing arm has grown back. But things start to go south, and his skin begins to turn green and scaly. He becomes the Lizard, a cross between human and lizard with violent tendencies. He begins work on making all humans lizard-like and similar to him. Peter, with the help of Peter's new love interest, Gwen Stacy, and her father, they manage to intervene, halting and eventually reversing these effects. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 came out in 2014 and continues on from where the reboot left off. This movie adds several new relevant characters to the mix. Firstly, we have Alexei Saitsevich, a Russian thug with a proclivity for mayhem, and interesting accents. He is eventually taken care of and imprisoned. But one of the near casualties of the Russian menace was Max Dillon, who happened to be saved by Spider-Man. As a worker for Oscorp, and someone with the inability to stand up for himself, he's told to stay back and fix a technical issue in the lab while everyone else goes home. Believing that he resolved the problem, he accidentally electrocutes himself and falls into a tank containing genetically engineered electric eels. This causes him to mutate into a human electrical power source and now becomes better known as Electro. Meanwhile, another revamped set of characters in Norman and Harry Osborn take centre stage in this movie. Norman this time is suffering from a rare genetic disease, something he regretfully informs Harry that it is hereditary. The next day, Norman dies, making Harry CEO of Oscorp. However, this title is short-lived as Oscorp's vice president frames him for Dylan's accident, resulting in Harry being removed from the company. This prompts him to seek out the help of Max Dillon to get him back into the Oscorp building. Here, Harry finds a special suit and equipment made by his father, as well as a special serum. Harry is now the Green Goblin, and the rest of the film involves a massive confrontation in New York with Spider-Man, Electro and the Green Goblin. After shocking devastation to New York, Peter manages to take out Electro, subdue Harry, but in the process narrowly misses out on saving Gwen. Several months later, the Russian criminal is broken out of prison and is roaming the streets in his new tank suit, with him referring to himself as Rhino. The movie essentially ends here with a clear intention for a sequel. However, the film wasn't deemed much of a success, and the Amazing Spider-Man franchise was eventually scrapped. It didn't take long before many discussions and negotiations were taking place between Marvel and Sony. On the one hand, Marvel made their intentions clear that they wanted Spider-Man in the MCU, or Marvel Cinematic Universe. But Sony holds the perpetual rights to the franchise, with the condition that they have to make at least one film every 5.75 years. Eventually a deal was struck with Sony retaining ownership and distribution rights of any solo Spider-Man films, but Marvel acquiring permission to include the iconic character in their MCU movie lineup. He first made a brief but noteworthy appearance in Captain America: Civil War in 2016, before going on to feature in his own MCU solo film, Spider-Man: Homecoming, and several other productions since. In part 2 of this video series, I'm going to break down Spider-Man's MCU journey and also review the new film, Spider-Man: No Way Home, which hit cinemas this week. However, I think it's worth looking back at all of the stories covered so far and rank them from worst to best. There are 5 films to contend with, so I'm going to count backwards from 5. In 5th place, Spider-Man 3. After a successful and promising opening 2 movies, it's a real shame that the franchise took such a dip. It's partly due to the disappointment that this ranks in 5th place, but that's not the only reason. Many of the creative choices of the characters in their respective arcs were misjudged and misguided at the very least. Rather than Peter's symbiotic Spider-Man feeling dark and edgy, it came across as quirky and strange. Another huge problem was that the film was over-congested, with too many villains and not enough time to develop them.
It's hard to believe what's happening. The brutality of it. I don't know how we can take any more.
Additionally, there were some questionable directorial decisions with the film, favouring lowest common denominator tricks and unrealistic crowd behaviour. It's not like there were any big scary monsters fighting nearby or anything. Despite these and many other issues people had with the movie, commercially it did very well, which was why there was initial plans for a 4th installment. At number 4, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. This film suffers from many of the same flaws as Spider-Man 3, and it's almost unforgivable given that they didn't learn from these previous mistakes. The end result was a film that was very surface level and lacked any real emotional weight. However, we all know money talks, and this fell way short of expectations, which inevitably had Sony looking for a totally different strategy. In many ways, it may have all been for the greater good, and perhaps the catalyst for Marvel and Sony reigniting the character with much more soul and creativity in the MCU. Number 3 is The Amazing Spider-Man. A film with the underlying feeling of unrealised potential. A new iteration brings new experiences, or does it? Much of the movie was treading on old ground, albeit with a slightly different shoe. Andrew Garfield's portrayal of Peter was a divisive one, with some feeling he injected more energy and humour into the role, while others felt that it didn't feel like Peter Parker at all. He was depicted as more of a cool and rebellious skater dude, and less like the nerdy and socially awkward version of his predecessor. It wasn't a bad film by any means, but considering it was a reboot, it failed to achieve what it set out to do: spark some real life and passion into the franchise. Maybe that's why they got Electro in the second one. At number 2, Spider-Man. An enjoyable and original superhero production. It provided a solid foundation not just for the sequel and many Spider-Man films after, but also an entire wave of comic book adaptations. Along with X-Men, this film created enough momentum for the entire genre that it took all the way to 2008 when films like Iron Man and the Dark Knight trilogy took the reins, and once again redefined our expectations of these types of movies. Spider-Man 1 wasn't perfect, but it felt relevant and certainly wasn't without moments of poignancy and contentment. So that leaves just the number 1 spot and one film remaining: Spider-Man 2. Arguably one of the best superhero movies ever made, it has real density in the characters, narrative, and even individual scenes. So much creative thought went into bringing this movie to life, and the attention to detail is genuinely amazing. Maybe they should have called this film The Amazing Spider-Man. It has a real human story running through the centre of it, but also enough complexity to warrant multiple viewings. This is a true high calibre Spider-Man depiction, and hopefully not the last. So that's it for this video. Later on in the week I'll be doing a part 2 with an overview of the MCU iteration of Spider-Man, as well as the review for the new movie No Way Home. I hope you enjoyed the video and stay tuned for the next one.